Hi, in this presentation we want to talk about the Gospel of Mark, which you should have read prior to this lecture. First off, before we begin looking at Mark itself, I want to make a few comments about the New Testament as a whole. There's four major literary genres present within the New Testament. We have the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. We have the letters, which can be subdivided into two main bodies. You have the Pauline epistles. There's 14 in that group. 7 of those are considered the authentic letters of Paul, that is most likely written by Paul himself, which he probably dictated to a scribe actually, but they are from Paul. The another 6 are called the Deutero-Pauline letters. These are letters that were written in Paul's name by disciples or members of his school, so they have the Pauline feel, if you will, but probably don't come from the actual hand of Paul. And then we have the letter to the Hebrews, which has been traditionally assigned to Paul. But you'll even notice, if you pay attention during Mass, which I'm sure you all do, that if there's a reading from Hebrews, it's no longer identified as a reading from Paul's letters to the Hebrews. It's simply listed as a reading from the letter to the Hebrews. Biblical scholarship today would say this didn't come from Paul or from his school. The theology is very different than the Pauline school theology, but traditionally it had been assigned to Paul. And then we have the Catholic epistles, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, which sort of have a lot of affinity with the Gospel of John in terms of their theology and approach towards Christ. And then you have 1 and 2 Peter, so 2 letters that are given the description of the authorship of Peter. And then you have James and Jude. All right, so in that group of letters, again, 7 letters in the Catholic epistles. So you should pay attention to that, right? That you have 14 Pauline epistles and 7 Catholic epistles. And Catholic here means these were seen as epistles that weren't addressed to a specific community, unlike Paul's letters, like to the Romans or the Corinthians or what have you, but to a generic person or a group. They aren't as specific in terms of the audience. Then you have another kind of literary genre, Acts, and we know these from ancient world. Acts have somebody goes on a journey usually in Acts, and different things happen to them as they travel around. And we have one of those types of books, the Acts of the Apostles, which most scholars would say is written by the same author who wrote Luke. So people will often talk about Luke being a 2-volume set, the Gospel of Luke and then the Acts of the Apostles. Of course, the Gospel of Luke talking about the life of Jesus, and the Acts talking about after Jesus' ascension, the work of the Spirit coming upon the disciples and the work that they did to spread the word of Christianity. Then you have one example of apocalyptic literature. This is the book of Revelation. There are apocalyptic motifs in all, particularly in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as well as some of the Catholic epistles and even in some of the Pauline epistles, but those aren't apocalyptic literature. We only have one document in the New Testament that would be called apocalyptic literature, and that's the book of Revelation. Before we jump into further discussion about the Gospels, and particularly about Mark, let's make sure we recognize that the world in which these texts come from is very different than one that we know and inhabit today. This is taken from Bruce Molina's work on the social science reading of Scripture, his commentary on the Synoptic Gospels, and he makes this great sort of analogy or comparison, better word, between the culture of the first century and our 21st century American culture. And the first century Mediterranean culture, of course, Israel would be part of that culture. 90% of the population was rural, and 10% was urban. Direct opposite from our experience here in the United States, where only 10% of our population lives in the farmland areas and what have you, while 90% live in cities or major metropolitan areas. In Jesus' day, 95% of the population was farmers or somehow extracted a living through working with the land or mining, what have you. Today, only 5% of our U.S. population is engaged with farming or mining. In Jesus' day, only 2 to 5% of the population was literate, could read and write. In contrast, here in the United States, only about 2 to 5% of the population is illiterate, that is, of adults who can't read. When I do adult formation sessions in parishes, I'll often ask people to raise their hand if they know of somebody who cannot read and write. And I'll invariably get a couple hands, and it pretty much breaks down to about 5, maybe 10% of the people will raise their hand. And then I'll say, well, if I had asked in Jesus' time the question, how many of you know somebody who could read and write, I'd get the same number of hands. Life expectancy. In Jesus' day, the average person lived to 39. Now, there were people who lived longer, into their 50s, 60s, 70s, but that was pretty rare that you'd live into your 70s or 60s. The average life expectancy was 39 years if you got past the age of 6, because 33% of all children die by the age of 6. Very tenuous the life of a child was very tenuous until you got to about that age. Think about that. 39, therefore, was kind of the average life expectancy. Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his public ministry. We often think of him as a very young man, because today 30 is young. But in Jesus' day, that's kind of middle age, comparatively, relatively, to our life expectancy today. He was a 50-year-old comparatively, you could say. So he had, at least in that culture, had lived a longer than just a young man. He was more middle age. Because today, life expectancy is 79 years. Twice that is from Jesus' time. And only 3% of our children die before the age of 6. Dramatic sort of difference. Then I provide you with some population numbers of both of Jerusalem, Capernaum, and Nazareth. Most people could say Nazareth is more around that 500, 600 number. Compare that to Milwaukee, where we have about 1 million people. And, I bet you many of you haven't even been to Wausau in Wisconsin. And that was just a city I picked out because it had about 38,000, 35, close to this 35,000 number from Jerusalem. So just to give you a sense of population size. There's one statistic that's similar. So far we've seen a lot of diversity between the first century context and our own, or distinction. But no, here's one statistic that's about the same. In Jesus' day, about half of all the children were raised in broken families due to death. Life was tenuous. We have about the same statistic here, where only about half of the children are being raised in intact two-parent families. But the difference would be that in our context today, mainly that's due to divorce, and not so much because of death. Then we can take a look at the political situation. There was very, we have a fairly stable system here in the United States. We've had 45 presidents. 3 have been murdered, and 1 was deposed. We could think that meaning Richard Nixon, who resigned because he was about to be impeached. But the situation is very different in the time of Jesus. The Roman Empire had 79 emperors, 31 of them, right? So not quite half, but a good portion, we could say 40% of them were murdered. That's one way to do regime change when you have a dictatorship. 6 committed suicide, and 4 were deposed. So again, if you just do the math there, then basically half of all the Roman emperors were somehow forced out of office through murder, suicide, or being overthrown. All right. So again, very distinct lived experience during Jesus' time than our own. So we have to be aware of that as we start to read the scriptures. Now, what is a gospel? Well, it just means good news or announcement, pronouncement. The genre is debated amongst biblical scholars. Some people see a lot of comparisons to what ancient biography, or what's called a bios, but when you really drill down into that type of literature, there's some differences, some distinctive elements in a gospel that you don't find in a bios. So that doesn't seem to be a great analogy. Some people make comparisons to the Greek novel. Let's say if you want to read one of these, Joseph and Anna-Seth is a nice one. And there's some comparative elements there. But again, when you really look at the form of a Greek novel and a gospel, there's some difference, some variation. So it doesn't seem to fit underneath that literary genre. So many people will say that the gospel is a unique Christian form of literature, sui generis, has a connection to a bios, has some elements from the novel, but it's really, if you will, a distinctive Christian literary type. It was written in Koine Greek, and Koine was the common, means that in fact, common Greek. So this is not highfalutin, well-educated Greek. It's the commoner's sort of Greek language that we find in the Gospels and in the rest of the New Testament. Now, here I'll give you a little definition of a gospel. Define it as a literary work that proclaims a faith-filled portrait of Jesus by reproducing representative words and deeds from the community's stories about his life. So that's not a bad definition for a gospel. Now, we got to think about how gospels come to be. And here I am following what we find in Dave Erboom, paragraph 19, and the Catechism for the Catholic Church, paragraph 126. And in both documents, it stresses that the gospel has 3 stages of formation. Okay, so first we have the life and teachings of Jesus, pretty obvious. And most people believe Jesus was born in 4 BCE, that's before Common Era, we might say BC. And that, so he was not born at 0 BC. Most people say 3 or 4 BCE. And then he died in 30 CE or AD, CE meaning Common Era. So he lived to be about 33, 34 years old. Well, then we can imagine that we have an oral tradition, people telling about what Jesus said and did. And of course, that would have been happening while he was still alive. So that's why we have this date of 27. And that extends really, in terms of what we capture within the New Testament, to the closing of the canon of the New Testament, at least of the books that are in the canon, around 95 CE. So we have a long period in which people are communicating the message of Jesus and his life and significance orally. And again, this would make sense because if only 3 to 5% of the population can read and write, the least effective way you could communicate the good news would be by writing it down. If you wrote it down, only 3 to 5% of the population could understand what's there, while orally everyone can understand, except for those who would be deaf, obviously, but could understand what you're talking about. And then, of course, the third stage then is, so we have the life, and then we have oral tradition. Now we'll talk, there's some things in that oral traditions, like, for example, Paul's letters are being written in that time as well. And something that we talk about in the other video, the Q source, a list of Jesus' sayings, most scholars would say was written around 45 CE. So there are some written documents that are being produced, but we don't have a full-fledged gospel, at least until about 65 or 68, when most people would date the writing of the Gospel of Mark. And then we have the Gospel of Matthew, which most people would date at 80 CE, Luke at 85, and then most people would date the Gospel of John as being written at either 90 or 95 CE. Now the question becomes, well, why did people start writing down Gospels then? And I think we can identify 3 key reasons. First off, around that date you have the disciples dying or have died. And so there's a sense that we need to put this message, since we don't have authoritative apostles and disciples able to communicate the message of Jesus and to talk about his life, we better put this down in writing, because writing is able to fix, the tradition. And the other reason why we might have gospel is being produced at this point is that that Christianity is probably spreading into the upper classes, and as it moved into the upper classes, you had people with both the monetary ability to sponsor writing, and also you had people who would value having something in writing because they can read. So that might be another reason why we start to have Gospels written around 65 to 95. Christianity is expanding into the literate class. And then finally, the advantage of having a written text is that you have a fixed text. You have a fixed version of the story of Jesus. And again, a third reason we can imagine why Gospels are starting to be written is that as Christianity is spread geographically over a number of areas, there may be a need to make sure there's unity amongst these different communities. And a written text provides this sort of authoritative telling of the story of Jesus that can be referred to in common by all the different communities and not be dependent upon oral tradition, which is more fluid and flexible. All right. So if we were to imagine how Gospels come to be, a little exercise you can do is think about if you were invited by your parish community to give a short talk on this question: what does Jesus' life mean for the person of faith today? And you had to pick out stories from Jesus' life to do that, to make that claim about the meaning of Jesus' life for us today. The question might be, well, first thing you may do is say, well, what does this community need to hear? What's the pressure points in their present experience? What is the growing edges they might be having to deal with? What might be the consolation that they would benefit from? So you do your kind of own assessment of, well, okay, they want me to ask, what does the life of Jesus mean for us today? Well, what's the need out there? What's the situation? And then you'd probably pick up a few stories and put them in an order to kind of address that so that you could connect with people's own lived experience. Well, this is what is kind of an example of what we see happening, the dynamic we see happening within the Gospels. That we probably have Gospel writers who are trying to help their community deepen their faith in Jesus Christ. And part of that process is to look at where they're at. They're what's called their Sitzenleben, their life setting. Because the Gospel is not just a chronology of Jesus' life. We can imagine the Gospels were put together in sort of this fashion, what I call the string of beads analogy. So we have this charismatic string. There's a basic storyline, plot line of Jesus' life. All right? But then the Gospel writers have different oral stories about what Jesus said, his parables, etc., some miracles he performed, some controversies he had with Pharisees and temple authorities and what have you, some actions that he performed, maybe cleansing the temple, what have you. So he has those different traditions, whether some of those in writing, some of those oral. And now he's got to figure out how is he going to put these together. Again, he has this basic outline of Jesus' life, this charismatic string, but then he's got to place these things in some order. And that's what I have here, is that he's trying to make known the proclamation of Jesus' life by organizing these beads, this material, in a pattern story so as to address this fundamental question in their faith community. What does Jesus' life mean for the person of faith? So the goal is not to write a chronology of Jesus' life, but to proclaim Christ, to bring people to deeper faith in Christ, to tell the story in a way that draws out the significance of Christ for the person of faith. Now, we know this is how Gospels were put together. One way we know they're put together is because we're told that's how they're put together by the earliest historian. The earliest church historian we have is a guy named Eusebius, who wrote this book called Ecclesiastical History in the late 3rd, early 4th century. And the cool thing about Eusebius is that he would quote other people that wrote before him and he'd dump their material into his book and say, hey, I got this from so-and-so. And this is an example. In terms of the authorship of Mark, Eusebius says, well, this is what Papias says about how Mark wrote his gospel. Now, who's Papias? He was a bishop who lived from 60 to 130 CE. So think about Jesus. He died around 34. Papias is born 25 years after that, right? And, so he's within that generation that he could have heard the story more directly. And so there's a pretty early source about how did Mark write down his gospel. This is what Eusebius, citing Papias, says. Mark, having become the interpreter-translator, the Greek there can be translated either way, interpreter or translator. So Mark, having become the interpreter or translator of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order, okay, whatsoever he remembered of the things done or said by the Lord. Okay, for he neither heard nor followed the Lord, that is, Mark never did that, right? But afterwards, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted, now this is Peter who's doing this, who adapted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving an orderly account of the Lord's saying. Accordingly, Mark did no wrong in thus writing some things as he remembered them, for he made it his aim to omit nothing he had heard and to state nothing therein falsely. So what are we hearing from Eusebius? Well, Mark put these things in down accurately, but he not in the exact chronological order of Jesus' life, but rather what he remembered and things he had heard Peter say about the Lord, and he followed Peter's custom of adapting the way he tells the story to the needs of his hearers. And so, what do we know? Mark is not an eyewitness. He learned about Jesus through Peter. We also hear that Peter didn't give an orderly account of Jesus' life, but rather selected and adapted stories to address his audience's own particular needs or circumstance, and that Mark imitated Peter's example. So he's not writing history or biography, but rather arranging the materials to address his community's circumstances and need, like Peter did when he orally preached the gospel. So, the way that Mark constructs his story of Jesus reveals the burning issue within his community, since he, like Peter, ordered the sayings and events in the story with the goal of addressing the community's pressing needs. This is very crucial for modern biblical scholarship. The understanding that, to understand Mark's intention, remember, Dave Irwin says we have to understand the original author's intention. Therefore, we have to kind of get at what was going on in Mark's community that he's trying to address through the way he tells the story of Jesus, so that we can open up the meaning and significance of Jesus more profoundly. So, let's turn to Mark. Now, you've read Mark, I hope, by the time you've begun this presentation. So if I were to ask you, having now read Mark, what would you identify as the theme song of Mark? And I don't mean writing your own theme song, but, if you had to look out into the common, popular music of our day, or classical music, what song would seem to capture the spirit of Mark, think about Star Wars. We all know that Star Wars theme, da 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 da, and say that somehow communicates the feel of the movie Star Wars. So what song would you pick for the Gospel of Mark? Well, here's my candidate. I think we should pick the theme song to The Lone Ranger. Now, you remember this song? It's actually technically called the William Tell Overture. The William Tell Overture. It goes da-dun, 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 da-dun. Okay, the theme song, right? Why would I ever say the theme song for the Gospel of Mark would be that from the Lone Ranger? Well, I use Ranger as an acronym for the 6 major themes we find in the Gospel of Mark. And as you see, as we unpack this, many of these 6 themes relate to the story of the Lone Ranger in some ways, loosely. So first off, what's Mark trying to talk about? He's talking about how Jesus is coming upon the earth to reclaim the world from Satan. And, Jesus, particularly the first half of the gospel, is portrayed as sort of beating up on Satan, kind of like the Lone Ranger, right? Comes and takes on the bad guys, those mainly Satan and his minions who've infected people through disease and what have you, that Jesus is somehow freeing them from. So that's a big part of Mark's gospel, is that Jesus has come to reclaim earth, that I think Mark sees as Satan sort of being in control of, and now God is coming back to make this again part of his territory, to make it safe for folks, and again an extension of God's power within the earthly realm. Another theme is the anonymous Jesus, like the masked man. If you remember in the Lone Ranger stories, he was always asked, who was that masked man at the end of the story? Well, did you notice how many times Jesus tells his people he's just healed, don't tell anybody that I did this. And of course, they immediately go and tell everybody he did this. That's called the messianic secret, that motif where Jesus says to people, don't tell anybody I did this for you. We go into some detail about what's up with that messianic secret. I think we could come up with a couple of explanations. One is that in the Gospel of Mark, I think he has a sense that you really can't understand the power of God and what God's doing through Jesus if you just see him as a miracle worker. And so one reason why Jesus says don't tell people is they'll misunderstand him, because the second half of the Gospel of Mark is all about how Jesus has to go to the cross and suffer. And if you see Jesus as just a big, powerful, being who can beat up on Satan and don't see that he has to suffer death, well, you're going to misunderstand him. I think that's the key thing behind the messianic secret and the purpose of it. Okay, N stands for Nimrodic disciples. It's been often noted that the portrayal of the disciples in Mark isn't real flattering. And so I like to use this word Nimrodic because you get this idea of the disciples being a little dense at times. However, we should know that the word Nimrod originally had a positive connotation. There's a figure in the Bible named Nimrod. He appears in Genesis, and we're told that he was a great hunter. In fact, there's a high school whose mascot is the Fighting Nimrods up there in the Upper Peninsula. Why would they name that? Because it was seen as a positive figure. The word Nimrod only got a negative connotation with Bugs Bunny. When that cartoon was made, you had the script writers have Bugs Bunny often say to Elmer Fudd, "Oh, you're such a Nimrod." Of course, because Nimrod was a great hunter. Of course, that was ironic, because if you remember the old Bugs Bunny movies, Elmer Fudd was a failure as a hunter. Okay, so this is my point. The disciples don't quite get Jesus. I think the reason there, as we'll, is that I think they're kind of discouraged, this community. They believe that Jesus, when he was here on earth, was really able to beat up on Satan, but now they're feeling pressure. They're probably being persecuted by not just the Romans, but by their families, because they've taken up with this new religion and maybe has felt some rejection. And, I think and maybe they feel like they haven't been as faithful as they'd like to be. And so one reason by portraying the disciples as not being perfectly faithful individuals or getting it totally, a sense of who Jesus is from the start, is to give them hope. The hope that, look, the disciples weren't perfect. They came gradually into the faith. Give yourself a break a little bit. Be patient with yourself if your faith isn't as full as you'd like it to be. I think that's one of the purposes behind the portrayal of the disciples. But then, I think in Mark's understanding, they become the ways that God's kingdom is ongoingly unfolded within the world after Jesus' death. The G I have here standing for Giddy Up Gospel. Even that theme song with, notice how fast that, we can all imagine that kind of fast pace. Well, this gospel of Mark is a very fast paced gospel. It's the shortest of all four gospels in the New Testament. But the word "uthos," which means immediately, appears over 40 times. Jesus is always immediately doing this, and it's particularly the first half of the gospel. It's a miracle after another. There's very little dialogue. It doesn't slow down much at all. It's just a series of actions. And so this seems to be what people will call a gospel in a hurry. That seems to portray or represent Mark's gospel well. The next letter is Eucharistic power. I think, again, we have a discouraged community, feels somewhat persecuted. They believe Jesus had great authority and power when he was here, but now they feel sort of abandoned. And I think one thing that Mark wants to tell his community is, you guys don't get it. You don't get that the power of God is still as present for us today as it was back then, if you only understand the meaning and significance of the Eucharist. We could go into more explanation of this. For me, a real convincing portrayal of this element in the Gospel of Mark is argued in Father Eugene Laverdiere's commentary called The Beginning of the Gospel of Mark. Great commentary, 2-volume set, really unpacks this well. And then finally, the R stands for redemptive suffering. The whole second half of the Gospel of Mark is this long journey towards Jerusalem, where Jesus 3 times tells his disciples, I'm going to Jerusalem to die on the cross, and everybody has to take up their cross if they want to follow me. So this theme of suffering that bounces off the kind of the power of Jesus, who beats up on Satan, now this move towards accepting death, the greatest evil that we experience, but that it's redemptive. And so therefore, this speaks to Mark's community to say that even their sufferings has a redemptive purpose to it. All right. Now, if we were to talk about Gospel of Mark in more, rather than just not just themes, but sort of organize, according to this chart, the date. Again, we date this from about 65 to 70 CE. Who's he speaking to? Well, I think this is being a persecuted community of Christians. He's using oral sources, but also some written sources, particularly in chapter 5. You can some good evidence that that's probably a written source. Maybe also the Passion narrative. That might have been a pre-existing written source that he's using as well. So even Mark might have some written sources, but certainly heavily dependent upon oral tradition as well. The structure is a 2-part story. First half, we have Jesus, in the quick succession, performing these miracles, battling to establish the kingdom of God. And then we have this story of him healing a blind man and at Bethsaida. And it's a story where he has to take 2 attempts to heal the blind man. And most biblical scholars would say that's indicative of the work he still has to perform on the disciples' vision to understand who he is. And that whole second half of the gospel stresses him as the suffering servant. He's got to suffer his death on a cross. And the disciples have to come to understand that's an essential element to discipleship. And this is an important message for Mark to communicate with his community that's suffering from persecution themselves. Theme, I stated here, as Jesus' power and presence is available through the Eucharist, which sustains disciples during their suffering to continue the ongoing struggle to establish the kingdom of God here on earth. That's our point. We're supposed to continue that struggle. And it starts with the baptism of Jesus, and it ends with the empty tomb. Sort of interesting. The original ending of Mark's Gospel, and we can see this through the manuscript tradition, was with an empty tomb. Of course, our translation and versions today have resurrection narratives, and early on, people added on resurrection narratives. I think it's a misunderstanding of the purpose of Mark. If you read the first verse in Mark, the beginning of the first verse of Mark is begin of the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God. Now, what's interesting about that, there's no verb. It is not, this is the beginning, although some translations will do that to make it into a sentence. But this is not a sentence. It doesn't have the beginning. It has beginning. There's no article there. These are clear signs that that's supposed to be, that was, the original title of this gospel. It was not called the Gospel of Mark. It was called Beginning of the Good News of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Well, then it makes sense why Mark ends with the empty tomb, because it's just the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. I think from Mark's perspective, he understands that the gospel is a 2-volume work. He's written the first volume. What's the second volume? Well, with the resurrection of Jesus, then the Spirit is given to, shared with us, and the disciples are volume 2. We're volume 2. We continue the story of the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God. Through our actions, we're the hands of Christ now. We're the legs of Christ now. This idea that the resurrection ushers in not just the redemption of Christ, but also the work of Christ, and that we participate in it. I think that's why Luke kind of gets that. Again, we mentioned that Luke is a 2-volume set. We have the Gospel, and then we have the Acts of the Apostles, which is all about the life of the early church. I think Luke kind of understands what Mark was up to and sort of finishes the project, if you will. All right, so there we go. We've run through kind of a description of the New Testament as a whole and drilled down a little bit upon Gospels, what they are, their literary form, and in the way they came to be and their purpose. And then we look specifically at the Gospel of Mark as an example to see how Mark reflects some of that compositional technique that we see, how the Gospels came to be. In the other video, we talk about what's called the synoptic problem. How do we explain the similarities and differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke? So if you haven't had a chance to look at that video, that can be helpful to understand the connection between these 3 Gospels. All right, talk to you later.